Ranking Member Grassley.
Had the honor of serving Iowa in the Senate for 4 decades. I've been chairman of the Finance and Judiciary Committee, so I know what it is to be chairman of a committee, and I'm honored to serve with you on this committee as your chairman, and I'm ranking member. I've seen plenty of problems facing our nation, and most were resolved through bipartisanship. And bipartisanship is going to be really, really necessary if we're ever going to crawl out of our deep fiscal hole that we're in right now. Every week since becoming ranking member, I've tried to focus the conversation on America's fiscal problems. We're facing public debt that in a few years will surpass record levels set in the wake of World War II. But 5 of our first 6 hearings this Congress have been about climate change. We've discussed sea level rise, hurricanes, wildfires, and the state of the insurance industry. Climate change is always worth discussing and must be discussed. It should be on everybody's agenda. But more immediate threat within this committee's jurisdiction needs to be addressed. The United States is barreling towards a fiscal crisis. We've been on an unsustainable fiscal path for decades, and that's under both Republican and Democrat. And bipartisan pandemic spending accelerated our journey to this fiscal cliff that we're facing. In times of national crisis, the federal government must be able to respond with emergency spending, but once the crisis subsides, Congress must tighten its belt to put debt and deficit on a sustainable, manageable path. Unfortunately, the exact opposite approach was taken the past 2 years. Despite an economy well on its way to recovery, the Democrats who control the entire government, all 3 branches, or all 3 political branches, chose to go on a multi-trillion-dollar bipartisan or partisan spending binge. Prominent economists from previous Democrat administrations sounded a warning alarm. We had Larry Summers and Jason Furman being the most prominent speaking out. They correctly warned that the Biden administration partisan spending spree would have consequences. Those consequences are now coming to a head. Decades-high inflation is proving difficult to stamp out. Rapidly rising interest rates are taking a toll on our economy, most visible on our financial system. Several banks have found themselves flat-footed, holding on to older, low-interest government bonds that nobody wants to take in. The Fed finds itself behind the 8 ball. Further rate hikes are probably necessary to tame inflation. But doing so will put more stress on our financial system and the broader economy. And yet, President Biden and too many in Congress refuse to acknowledge that everyone knows to be true that our debt and deficits are unsustainable at unsustainable levels. We can no longer kick the can down the road. President Biden, I want to tell you, for the good of the country, you must show presidential leadership, no more playing politics. A good first step would be to engage Speaker McCarthy in bipartisan talks to raise the debt limit and lay the groundwork for fiscal discipline moving forward. This committee should also be engaged. Let's have a serious and frank discussion about our dire fiscal situations. Let's hold bipartisan hearings with respected economists and policy experts from both sides of the aisle. Let's examine our finances and find solutions. So let me be clear. I support an all-of-the-above approach to energy production. The majority of Iowa's energy comes from wind. I've been credited with creating the wind energy tax credit. We get 60% of our electricity today from wind, and in 3 or 4 years, that'll be 80%. I support renewable technologies before becoming more and more competitive. I hope 30 years ago when I got the wind energy tax credit passed, I was 10 or 15 years ahead of any discussion of climate change at that time. So I don't think I have to take a back seat to anybody doing what we can to fight global warming. Now we have oil and gas is clearly dominant in the United States energy sector. The reality is that fossil fuels account for 79% of U.S. energy consumption. It's naive to think that an energy transition will happen even in 10 years or that markets won't be able to keep up. Environmentalists blocking the permitting of new energy and mining projects will cause further delay. And for the United States to change to renewables is entirely proper. But when you think about how the third world nations are dependent upon cheap energy, and if we want to help them get out of the poverty hole that they're in, we're doing an injustice to them if we believe in that. Besides, we seem to be backing up the use of child labor in the Congo when we get lithium out of the Congo for our batteries, for our cars. So we need diversity to maintain energy security, and energy security is, of course, national security. Even President Biden understands that we're going to need fossil fuels well into the foreseeable future. So, Mr. Chairman, you've made your message on climate change loud and clear, but let's also focus on the immediate threats that squarely within this committee's jurisdiction. I thank you very much for listening to me.